It's safe to say that performance in gray zone warfare is a pretty heavy topic right now, so I figured I'd throw my hat into the ring and discuss what each setting does, so you guys have a better idea on what you should be tweaking and what you might be able to keep a little bit higher inside of the game. Even though most of the warfare that's going on is war with the Unreal Engine 5 crash handler, it's still a safe thing to say that the performance leaves a little bit to be desired right now. Hopefully with this guide, you'll be able to understand what the settings do and make adjustments accordingly to either improve your performance or to simply make the game look a lot better. There will be more guides coming up soon for different tweaks for gray zone warfare, but for now I'm going to stick this strictly to the settings. So if you have any questions about what any setting does, they'll all be timestamped below, so you'll be able to see what each one does. If this helps you figure things out, make sure to hit the usual buttons down below and join the Discord. It's the first link in the description, and it'll allow you to ask me or other people questions in there about different settings inside of gray zone or just optimization for your computer in general. There's also my streams that I do on Friday at 6:30 p.m. CST and on Sunday at 1:30 p.m. CST, the latter of which is a PC Sherpa live stream where I bring you guys in directly to help you with your issues one-on-one. Feel free to ask me any questions in the comments, in my streams, or in my Discord. Everything's linked below. But yeah, with all that out of the way, let's get through a couple caveats real quick before you start trying to test settings within the game. First things first is that this game does have some sort of dynamic shader compilation or something of the sort. I noticed when you go to new areas for the first time, there is a massive increase in CPU usage for a considerable bit until you actually get to the location. This can result in stutters or downright freezes for a little bit, which on occasion does cause some people to crash. This is different to Tarkov, if you play that game. In Tarkov, there's normally a pretty heavy importance set on single core performance and on cache bandwidth. With this game, it uses a good bit of your cores and also most of your threads, and it can even max out your CPU when you're loading into new areas. I don't know whether to be impressed or terrified by that, but that's something you should note, and that also might be the reason why your PC starts to freeze up if you're traversing the area. Depending on your system, you might be GPU or CPU bottlenecked. In gray zone, it looks like a good portion of you are GPU bottlenecked, at least based on what I'm hearing, though that could be different for some of you. So to put a long story short, if you have any sort of overlay like mine, say MSI Afterburner, which I made a guide out about, I'll link that below, or CapFrame X, or Hardware Info, or anything like that, or even Task Manager, though that can be sometimes inaccurate. If your GPU sits at roughly 100% usage, then you know that your GPU bottleneck. If it tends to fall below this, towards 80, 70, 60, etc%, then you can be pretty sure that you're at a CPU bound situation for your frame rate in that scenario. So just know if you hear me talking about GPU or CPU bound, that's what I'm talking about. Another thing too that I wanted to note if you're trying to test any settings quickly and on the fly is that the main menu is actually rendered in real time, quote unquote, kinda sorta. What I mean by that is you can go in and change settings while you're in the main menu and sort of see the effect. This was a really good place for me to do some benchmarking for some of these settings, as it's a repeatable scenario that I was able to boot up every single time and test the impacts of various different settings this way. Obviously, the actual game is more intensive than this, but it gives you a good place to see the difference. For example, if I set shadow quality to epic, you can pretty clearly see that something changed in the image quality. Setting it back down to low, you'll see that it changed again. I'm going to start with setting all of my settings to low, and we'll move up from there with also upscaling disabled completely, and I'll explain what each one of these does. Oh, and one extra thing to note really quick is that when you do apply some settings, they do require a restart, or at least it seemed to me to be that way. For example, for texture resolution, it didn't really fully apply until I did a full restart on the game. Other settings may be the same, and I tried to restart as many times as I could to see the differences, but you know, your mileage may vary. So the first thing that I want to talk about is the lighting of this game. As you can kind of tell, it's pretty amazing, and the way they do this is with Unreal Engine 5's Lumen technology, or at least to the best of my knowledge, that's what they're using. If I pull it up really quick, there's an article that I'll link in the description. It's the documents for Unreal Engine, and they talk about global illumination if you're interested. There is obviously different ways to do this, baked lighting versus dynamic lighting, but it seems like for a good bit of gray zone warfare, they are using dynamic lighting. The reason I think this is because of the way the lighting reacts to the environment. Let's take these lights, for example. You can see they're shimmering a good bit, and they don't really stay still, if that makes any sense. You can also see, and this is a artifact that I couldn't get rid of, when you aim in with your sight, there is a slight amount of ghosting on the object. So you can see, for example, when on ADS, on ADS, there's a little bit of ghosting, and I believe that is also directly from them using dynamic lighting. When anything on your screen blocks the path between the lighting and your camera, it sort of gets forgotten and needs to render it again, or to add it back to the scene, if that makes any sense. This is a little bit of a problem and kind of annoying, honestly, and I don't really like how it looks, but it is due to that fact, if I had to guess. I'd like to know what the devs think about this, and if they're ever going to patch out, say, this issue, for instance, as this ghosting is a pain. This relates directly as well to the global illumination quality. That's the first setting inside of the graphics quality options. Well, past these preset options here. As you can see, Grayzone describes that it determines the quality of dynamically calculated indirect lighting bounces. So the lighting that I was saying before with, for example, the rays bouncing, you can see it's blocking the camera so I don't see those rays, and then they sort of get drawn back in over time, right? That's sort of a lighter way to do that dynamic lighting. It controls the shadowing of the sky as well, along with ambient occlusion. If you don't know what that is, that essentially is the shadowing around certain objects in the world. So if you can see, for example, how there's shadowing around parts of my gun that aren't like in the light, for example, like my front sight, or if I check the mag here real quick, you'll see like in the chamber it was darker, inside of the mag it's going to be a little bit darker, and that is ambient occlusion right there. You can sort of see it on the box as well. See how it gets like sort of de-drawn once my sight blocks that? That's ambient occlusion right there. Just a light amount of shadowing around stuff. The quality of that is controlled by this setting. The only issue is I feel like this isn't properly applied. Like, for example, if I pick this up to high here, I do see a difference in the ambient occlusion quality. It gets a lot more, what's the word? Less fizzly, right? But the main issue is it's not really changing this issue. Maybe this is just a result of how they do the lighting, but the amount of rays, or however they're doing this lighting, doesn't change with this. No matter how you change the illumination quality, this relic is always here. And, well, Madfinger, and the off chance you're watching this, I'm not using any sort of upscaling here either. So this isn't any sort of artifact from that. I'll show that real quick. Right here. You can see that no matter what pipeline I use, this artifact is still here. I really hope it does get addressed, as that shimmering is incredibly annoying. Regardless, you're here for performance, so if you're worried about performance, just don't have this set to epic. Every other setting here didn't increase or decrease my performance. It was really just when I set it to epic that there was a little bit of a performance hit. I believe this is starting to use some sort of expensive calculation for the ray tracing, as it says down here, though they're not really precise, or no pun intended, but they're not really precise on what is happening here. Maybe it's some sort of directly hardware accelerated ray tracing, I'm not sure. Regardless, if you're worried about performance, make sure this is off of epic. And besides that, it doesn't seem like there's any other performance difference. For me here, I'm going to have this on high still, but you can go ahead and change this to whatever you like, now that you know what it does. Next up, I want to talk about shadow quality, and this is a pretty important one. I've heard a lot of people complaining about how shadows look in this game. Let me try to find an example of what I'm talking about.
One eternity later.
It occurred to me that I was an idiot, and there's an example of shadowing right here. So, for example, with these shadows, you can clearly see that since I'm on low shadow quality right now, there's a lot of shimmering on the edges of those shadows, if you can see that right there. The higher you set your shadow quality, the better that this shimmering becomes, because the resolution of the shadows increases. Secondarily, if I go out front really quick, I can show you that shadow quality directly affects the distance at which shadows start to render. So if I go out to the front here, I'll stand on these boxes just so you can see far away. And if I go to my settings, you're going to see that the shadow distance, say on these trees over here, begins to pop in. So let's see, if I go to medium here, you see how there's a little bit of shadowing added to these trees, and that distance is directly set by this setting as well. It is both the distance. Oh, I just changed texture resolution like I'm stupid. Okay. But you can directly see that the distance of the shadows is affected by how high I have this shadow quality set. Also, when I go up to high, there is a significant little dip in performance. And on top of that, there's this sort of fog that's added. I'm not sure if this is volumetric fog or what this over here is, but regardless, it's added, and could potentially impact your gameplay, but it also does impact your GPU bound performance. So, just keep that in mind. If you're trying to aim for performance while still retaining some image quality, it might be best to set this to medium. I'll show you why back where we found that comp. Back in here, you're going to see that the shadowing, at least on medium quality, is a bit better. There's still some flickering, but the amount of flickering is reduced. Now, if I set this to say high, and this is where if you have a more powerful GPU, this comes into play, the amount of flickering drastically reduced. There's still a little bit, but you can clearly see the difference between high and medium shadow quality. That resolution improves, and so too does the actual shadow quality. Moving up to epic helps a little bit more, but it's harder to see. There's not much of a performance impact that I could tell though between high and epic, so if you're going up to high, you might as well go up to epic if you got the room. But if you don't have the room for performance, stick to medium. This will help reduce the amount of flickering in the shadows, hopefully allowing you to see a bit better in those shadowy thickets that are around towns. The next thing is texture resolution. If you're around and, care about optimization a good bit, you probably know what this does. It just changes the details of textures in the map, in the entire world. What I did notice, however, and I'll try to put this on screen for you guys, is that, for example, in the main menu, having the texture quality too low made it harder to see through some of the netting and fencing that was in the menu. With that being noted, it might be a good idea to steer clear of low unless you just don't have the VRAM capacity to handle the game. Medium is the default for the game, and I recommend sticking to that unless you have, say, 10, 12, 16 gigabytes of VRAM or more, and then you might be able to put it up further. I believe, and don't quote me on this, I'll put the tweet up, that they're going to be addressing texture quality in the near future, trying to disable the higher settings for those of us who don't have the VRAM capacities for it, which is going to be pretty nice. So yeah, if you have an 8 gigabyte card, stick at medium, but if you have enough VRAM to start experiment with this, feel free to press it higher. If you notice any abnormal stuttering though, where it's getting pretty constant amounts of stuttering, then it might be a good idea to start ticking this lower. If you have one of the overlays like I have here, you'd be able to add the VRAM allocation / actual usage to this overlay, so you'll be able to see if you're maxing out on your VRAM or not. Next though is effects quality, and frankly, I'm a little confused on this one. It's not the normal type of effects quality that you'd see in other games, say like PUBG, where it just controls explosions and, gun particles and bullets hitting the wall and stuff like that. It has a lot more control on the actual quality of the game than I assumed it would. When I swap to medium, I get a slight performance hit. Like for example, switching to medium, it's really hard for me to actually tell what's changing. The description says it determines the quality of visual effects, which I figured, but also lighting in the game. Like for example, let me put this up a bit higher, and you can look at the image that's a result and see if you can find any difference. I struggled to actually see it, frankly, but if you can see it, feel free to adjust accordingly. Something that I do see is possibly the quality of the trees at distance over here, but that's also controlled by a different setting. So I'm really confused by this one, Madfinger. If I could get some clarity about this would be great, because I'm not really sure what's going on with this one. Again, it seems to get a little darker outside. Like I'm not sure. They weren't clear about what this does, and I also can't see it. As far as performance goes, though, low was technically the best, though they were all within a couple frames of each other when I was at, it was between 68 and 70 FPS. So generally, if I set this to epic, there really isn't too much of a performance impact. If you see a difference, feel free to keep this up, but in my opinion, I see this as a performance hogger that doesn't really affect the game quality that much. I'll post a comment though in the description if I find something that contradicts what I'm thinking right now. For now, for most of you, I'd recommend having it to low. Next up is the reflections quality. I'll give you 3 guesses to figure out what this does. It affects the reflections, but there is a bit more to this, and you can actually have this a bit higher depending on your card. So let me put this on the side of the screen here so you can see it, and I'll show you what this does. So having it set to low right here is how this looks right here, but I want you to see the difference once I set it to medium. Having it set to medium adds a bit more reflection to this metal table outside and clears up the reflection here a little bit. It's noted in the settings though that setting this to high and above high utilizes more precise ray tracing methods. Again, not sure what these are, but you can clearly see the difference in the reflection. It's much more cloudy, but also a bit more realistic than previously. However, there is a performance hit when you go up too high, and obviously Epic has the same sort of performance hit, but the actual ray tracing is a bit more fleshed out and a bit higher resolution. What I did notice though is that depending on the object, there's this like spotty effect that you can kind of see right here on the ray tracing at the moment that sort of makes this not worth it for me. For the performance hit that it is, I really wouldn't recommend having it on for now. If you'd like to have slightly better quality reflections though, you can run it at medium and not really get that much of a performance hit. You can see I have medium here, and obviously my performance is fluctuating a decent bit here. There's not really that much of a difference, so having that extra little bit of quality is nice. Having that applied, the last setting that I want to talk about in the quality section is foliage quality. Now, obviously I'll have to go outside to show you that one. Going out to the front here, you're going to see that once I get up here, foliage quality sort of does something similar to object LOD quality. If you're familiar with that from the game Escape from Tarkov, you're going to see as I change foliage quality, the quality of the foliage, yes I know, shocking, increases at a distance. So this controls the distance at which the level of detail, or LOD as it says in the description, changes on the foliage. So you're going to see, for instance, when I go from low to medium, that foliage closer up is animated now. It adds a bit of life to the image. Even foliage that's further away got a bit more life to it. This increases the more you set this up, adding more detail to the foliage, and as you can see, when helicopters pass by and wind gets hit, it's pretty sick, I'm not gonna lie. I'm also not seeing too much of a performance hit with this either, so this might be something that you could set a little bit higher if you want a bit of eye candy. I just want to note though, and it's pretty impossible for me to test this, but having this higher quality of foliage may adversely affect you when you're traversing large areas quickly due to the amount of stuff that needs to be rendered. Having the extra foliage at a higher quality may impact that, so do keep that in mind if you bump this up if you're having a ton more issues when you're flying through helicopters. However, I think it looks really nice and I haven't noticed too much of an impact yet, so I'm going to have it set to high. Epic, as you can see, draws it in even further, and there's not much of a performance hit to this either, but on the off chance that anything is discovered, I want to be a bit safer. Now on to post-processing. I recommend having this set to low, and the reason for it is not really because it controls the quality of depth of field or bloom or motion blur, but that when you set it above low, you get a bit of shadowing that's applied to the edges of the screen. For me, I really don't like this, as it sort of makes the edges of my screen a bit harder for me to see, and if a player peeks on the edge of that screen, I don't want to miss it because it was a bit darker than the rest of my screen. If this is something that you'd like to have though, feel free to set this to medium. Now obviously motion blur I would keep off. Sharpening is your own personal preference. Colorblind mode, again, personal preference and strength. And now we go to the anti-aliasing or upscaling method. This is going to be a doozy. Let me get the elephant out of the room first. Yes, there is such a thing as frame generation, but those frames aren't real frames. When you first get into the game, I believe the default values they have set for this are FSR with frame generation on, and this set to either quality or balanced. What this does, FSR or XeSS or DLSS, is that they're all upscalers, or well, technically TSR as well. What that means is it takes a lower internal resolution and upscales it to your native resolution using whatever algorithm is selected. DLSS is Nvidia's algorithm that only runs on 20, 30, and 40 series GPUs, while FSR is more widely compatible with a slight degradation to image quality in comparison to DLSS generally. XeSS is Intel's version of an upscaling solution, which has a specific version that is made specifically for Intel's graphics cards, but is also compatible with other graphics cards on the market. And finally, there is TSR, or Temporal Super Resolution, and this, besides controlling anti-aliasing, as you can see here, also controls, you can set like a custom resolution here. So you can, for example, run the game at 50% of the resolution, and then you get the performance benefits that come with that. You can even, if you wanted to, set it all the way to 30% of the native resolution, but please, oh god, please don't do that. If you don't use temporal super resolution, this setting gets grayed out. So for example, if I go to DLSS, you can no longer change this resolution slider, as this slider now gets changed by the different qualities of DLSS that you choose. So for example, for DLSS, if I choose quality, it's at 67%, and that's the same thing with FSR on quality, it's also at 67%. So you'll be able to see, for example, based on what quality of upscaling you choose, what percentage of your native resolution it's starting at to upscale. For your preferred upscaler, depending on what GPU you have and depending on which one you can use, you're going to want to stay at as high of a super resolution setting as you can while still getting the performance benefit. For most of you, I would recommend quality, but for some of you, I understand that it may be required for you to set this a little bit lower in order to get sustainable performance. Quality is at 67% of your native resolution, whatever that may be. Balance is at 59%. Performance is at 50%. And ultra performance, which I really don't recommend you use, is at 33%. For some of these as well, you can select a native anti-aliasing solution, which for both FSR and DLSS, I think looks pretty dang good. Now, for most of you, you're going to have FSR frame generation available. To explain what this does in, a reasonable amount of time, because I know there's a lot of people who have been claiming this doubles their performance. It's not really a doubling of performance. What this is doing is it's inserting a fake frame in between frames. So for example, if we have 5 frames on the screen, it will try to interpolate the image in between those 2 frames, delaying the most recent frame to insert a fake frame in between those 2. This can add a good bit of latency and isn't really advised if you don't have above 60 FPS to start with, at least in my opinion. Your sensitivity to the latency of frame generation is honestly personal preference. It's hard to convey that feeling to you in any meaningful way. What I do want to show you though is that frame generation can have some artifacts. So for example, when I move my sight across the screen right here, you can see that there's a considerable amount of ghosting. If you're seeing this ghosting and it's extremely annoying to you when you're moving the sight around like this, it may be advised to turn frame generation off to help reduce that. Also, if you're playing and you feel like you're not as responsive as you were before, frame generation might also be to blame, as it does increase the latency, especially if you're running at a lower than 60 FPS refresh rate. This is why for most streamers who say have more expensive cards, say a 4080, 4090, etc., they're able to hit those high refresh rates from the get-go, like roughly what I'm seeing up there. Then they can use frame generation, specifically DLSS frame generation, but we'll get to that in a second, to hit even higher frame rate targets, sort of widening the gap and making it look like those cards are performing way better than they actually are in comparison to, say, my card or your card. Like, for example, you can see if I just ran frame generation, it would look like I'm running roughly 100 FPS with quality FSR upscaling enabled. But if I went to disable the frame generation and just had the quality FSR on, you'll see that in reality, I'm running closer to 60 frames. So when you see that number, don't take it on face value, as they could be using frame generation to make the game feel smoother for them. And in reality, it's not really the performance they're getting. Those frames don't actually take your input, so it's not like the game is more responsive. The difference between FSR and DLSS frame generation is that DLSS's frame generation is only available for 40 series cards. FSR's frame generation, on the other hand, is available for everybody. But FSR frame generation, in my personal opinion, has less quality. I can't show you DLSS frame generation because I'm on a 3070 Ti, and like I just said, you need a 40 series. But arguably it's the one to pick if you're on 40 series. Just like I said, regardless of what frame generation you're choosing, make sure you have a high enough refresh rate to start off with before you go for frame generation, just to make sure that it still feels responsive enough to play. It is also highly recommended that you use Nvidia Reflex with this frame generation if you have access to it, to help reduce the latency, to make it feel a bit more snappy. What this does is it synchronizes the work that the CPU and GPU are doing by delaying the CPU workload just a bit to make sure that whenever the draw call for the GPU is ready to be presented, it can easily be sent to the GPU and the GPU instantly does it without having to wait for, say, the GPU to complete a different frame or anything like that. It's all synchronized. That reduces the latency. On plus boost just keeps your clocks higher on your GPU and tightens those timings a little bit to make it be a bit less delayed? That's the word, yeah. It also makes sure that the clocks on your GPU are boosting correctly, though for most of you, if you're running, say, at 100% GPU usage, they're probably clocking correctly. It's more made for scenarios where your GPU's not at 100% usage, so it may try to downclock to save power. If you're trying to reduce latency as much as possible, you could go for on plus boost, but if you're in a GPU bound scenario, you're probably just fine with on, and then with the frame generation, again, if you had the proper frame rate to use it. For me personally, since I have some issues with my performance when I'm on stream, I like running DLSS quality since I'm at 1440p. That's a 67% resolution of 1440p, which is upscaled. And then I might sharpen it up a little bit, say to like 10%. So let me get there real quick. There we go. I feel like this adds a pretty good image quality in the end, and it gives me a little bit more performance to work with. Your mileage may vary though, so feel free to adjust to whatever upscaler you like and all of that stuff now that you know what each does. Because I forgot at the beginning of the video, we're going to talk about the display now. Monitor is obviously whichever monitor you're using. Windowed mode is actually a little bit of a controversial topic. Most recommend full screen for the best latency possible, but really on Windows 11, windowed borderless mode, or Windows full screen in this case, is sort of the ideal mode to play, as they have optimizations made specifically for windowed titles. For this case, it's best to honestly run windowed full screen. It also allows you to tab out really quickly, which is nice. It's a little extra bonus. Since I'm on Windows 10 though, I tend to run full screen, that's windowed. I tend to run full screen as that's what this is currently optimized for, and Windows 10 does not have access to those same optimizations at the moment. Display resolution should be whatever you are natively running at. Don't set this to anything lower, and if you are, use the upscalers down at the bottom over here, right here, instead of lowering that resolution. Vertical FOV is completely up to you, it's your personal preference, though I guess technically there would be a performance impact. Don't worry about it. Set this to whatever you feel comfortable with and move from there. Vertical sync I would actually recommend disabling unless screen tearing is specifically a problem. If you don't know what screen tearing is, it's where a frame that's newer is presented on part of the screen before the older frame is removed from the top part of the screen. So you can see, like, for example, here, the image is torn across a line, causing it to look split, pretty much. If this is an issue for you, then I would recommend turning this on. Otherwise, if you're not experiencing it, don't worry about it and leave it off. These four settings here, brightness, contrast, saturation, and gamma, are all personal preference. I didn't see any performance impact with any of these, and you can feel free to adjust these as you will. I will warn you, however, that upping contrast does make darker areas darker. If you don't want to do that, you might want to up saturation instead, as that actually makes the colors pop more. Contrast, however, makes the lighter portions of the color lighter, and the darker colors darker, as you can see right there. And then, of course, if you're worried about the brightness of things and you're having trouble seeing in darker areas, upping your gamma may help you see through those as it ups the brightness of the image. It sort of washes it out, but on the flip side, you're able to see a bit more. It's up to you which one you want to choose. Finally, you can use a frame rate limiter if you are struggling with some performance of tasks in the background. For example, if you are attempting to stream this game and you're not on a super beefy computer, especially if you're on a single computer, you may want to limit the frame rate to ensure you have some GPU headroom for your encoder to do its thing. Also, the CPU might be a limiting factor if you're maxing out on CPU usage when you're loading into different areas, and I'm still working on finding a fix for that, so stay tuned to see some stuff about that as well. I'd also recommend keeping the frame limit on in the background, so that, for example, if you tab out, it lowers the frame rate dynamically to this performance so that it's not utilizing as much system resources when you tab out of the game. But yeah, with all that out of the way, that's pretty much everything. If you're wondering what settings I'm going to be running, it's probably going to be this that you see on screen right now. Keep in mind that this isn't for everybody, but I am running the recommended GPU for this game, so it's been pretty okay so far. There's going to be a good bit of adjustments to these in the future, so don't expect the performance you're seeing right now to stay this way. For now, I just wanted to explain what these settings are doing so you have a better idea of what to tweak. I may actually, just in case this ever adds additional performance costs, lower this down to medium. Let me do that. If I get more clarification on, say, the global illumination settings and the effects quality and what that does as well, I'll make sure to post that in the comments below. And as I was saying, this isn't like a magical performance guide, but again, I hope this helped you to figure out what each setting does. At the end of the day, knowing what each setting does will allow you to dynamically adjust and get a better image quality while still maintaining the same frame rate, or get more frame rate depending on what's going on. For now though, I hope this helped. Stay tuned for more Gray Zone guides in the future, and make sure to tune into my streams that are on Friday at 6:30 p.m. CST and on Sunday at 1:30 p.m. CST. Join the Discord, like and subscribe if this helped, yada yada, typical YouTuber baloney. And I'll see you guys very, very soon. Thanks for watching. And this is Clem, clocking out. Later.